So this is going to be a two-part video. The first part is where I'm going to show you how to make a composting toilet, a sawdust composting toilet. The second part is where we cover the actual process of how to dump it into your pile when it's ready. Now this is sometimes a controversial subject, and people are often very skeptical about it. I brought Megan out because she was one of those people who was skeptical about it at first. I got the idea and I'm like, hey, we should maybe try this out. It'll be really easy for us to get, it'll be one less thing to worry about as we're moving in. I don't know. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't really think it was going to work. I was pretty sure we were going to get typhoid or something, but we didn't. And, I've never gotten sick or got poop in my eyes dumping it or anything gross like that.
Yeah, and one of the concerns was it's going to stink up the house or anything. Was that an issue?
No, it smells really nice. I mean, because we get our sawdust from a sawmill, so it's like piney, sprucey.
How would you describe the process of actually doing it? How often do we have to dump the things?
Every couple of days, I mean, it takes 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. And you'll see later on when I show you the process, it does really only take 5 minutes. I mean, it takes me longer because I'm talking through the whole thing because I have a habit of doing that. But this is something that is often a good idea if you live in an area where it's hard to get septic tanks in particular. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of rural Alaska where entire villages just collect their stuff in honey buckets. Yeah, and what they do is they collect it in buckets and then they dump it in the town sewage pit. And then some villages actually have plumbing, and then actually there's a village that did a pilot program of doing this exact thing. They had a pilot program of Humanure composting toilets in the village of Kayana. Well, and part of the issue when people do live in honey bucket villages is you've got that bucket sitting in your house and people are not using cover material, so it really stinks. And something that they noted in that Kayana pilot project is that it cuts down on the stink when you compost it. In fact, it smells kind of good. Not only that, it kind of creates its own heat. And when your house isn't stinky, then that means you don't have to open the window as often, which means you spend less on heating and all kinds of stuff like that. So it's a really great option for remote and off-grid places. Might be something that you would want to consider. So if you're a little bit skeptical, just watch the video and might change your mind.
Yeah, you just have to get used to it, just like anything.
All right, that was good. You think they'll believe it?
Yeah, I'm sure.
One step closer to world domination. So my project right now is to build a new, what we call sawdust composting toilet, or also Humanure toilet. And I have this black bucket. We've made a couple of these before, and we always use black buckets. That way, once we retire a bucket, if we use it for carrying soil or something, we know which ones used to be our composting toilets. So the only thing I've really done for this so far is to cut legs. I cut them to the length so that when I add a piece of 5/8 inch plywood above it to act as kind of the seat for the platform for the toilet seat, so that the rim of the bucket will sit kind of just barely above that plywood. So this will be in the front, and that will be in the back. Kind of setting them around here like this allows me to take a measurement to know how long to make the sides, which is going to be about 18 inches. Alright, so here's how it's looking so far. I've put the sides on, all four sides. Looks like it's gonna, the bucket needs to sit slightly forward so that you have room on the back to do a bit of a hingey thing. Now I just have to cut some plywood for the top and make a cutout for the bucket itself. So this is roughly how the toilet seat is going to sit on here. And so I have 18 inches one direction. I have 15 3/4 the other direction. But this last little rectangle here needs to be a separate piece so that this can attach to the back and it hinges up and over. So it's going to need a 2.5 inch rectangular section to sit on the back. So this is to give me a rough idea of how the seat is going to sit so that I can then cut an appropriate hole for the bucket. I'm going to want it centered, same distance on either side, so it needs to go, let's say that's 2 1/4 on this side, 1 3/4 on this side, so it's going to be 2 inches from either side. So that shows me where the hole is going to be for the bucket, but also how the toilet seat will sit above it. So something happens here when you try to do this is that these things get in the way. They usually hit the rim of the bucket. So all you do is you take a mallet and you just kind of tap them out of the way. Like so. Perfect. So now it will sit so that there is no wood exposed. It's going to go, anything that goes in here is going to go perfectly into the bucket. There's going to be like no gap whatsoever. So this is where the composting toilet's going to live for now. It's in this kind of room under the stairs. That's going to be our bathroom. Now it's true that they make toilet seats that snap directly onto the top of a 5-gallon bucket, but most people prefer doing something like this just because it looks a little bit neater and nicer and less bucket-like, I guess. Some people make really fancy, elaborate ones. If you look online or if you look at the Humanure Handbook, some people really make fancy, nice-looking ones. This one was just made out of what I had laying around, basically. These 1x6s that we had actually used for living room flooring. And a piece of plywood that I had left from making some loft areas. So the investment was very, very small. So right over there in the trees, you actually see our outhouse. That's been there for a few years. We built that because I believe it's important to have an outhouse when you're living off-grid in Alaska. Here, you can see that we have a bin waiting for deposits from this brand new toilet that I just built. All you really need are some posts to put in the ground and 4 pallets. And you want to make it, we have some old rusty pieces of metal here that we're using to attach some of the pallets, or you can just screw them directly on. Either way, you want to make it so that it's easy to remove the pallets when it's time to take the compost out of there. But the main idea is this, that if you're waiting for a septic tank and for plumbing to happen, and paying for all of that to have like a more traditionally plumbed house with septic tank, not only is that going to run you probably close to like $30,000 plus, it takes a while. And the purpose of having something like this is, I think the term is low barrier of entry, meaning that with less than a day's work and probably like $50 in materials, you can get started. Like, you can have a system ready to go. All you need is some pallets, some posts, some scrap wood basically, a toilet seat, hinges, and some sawdust. And that's all you need to get started. I'm going to start with less than a day and $50. And then later on, yeah, maybe if we save up a bunch of money, we can do the 30 grand option. Fine. I'd rather do this because it gives us something usable, whereas when you have a septic tank, that stuff just sits in the ground. A lot of people are squeamish about using it anytime it might be in direct contact with like vegetables or something, like if you're growing potatoes or whatever. If it sits long enough like it's supposed to, it's really not an issue, but I can understand why that would make somebody squeamish. So some people will be like, okay, I'll use it on my fruit trees, but not on my vegetable garden. For a little history lesson, people used to just put the stuff straight onto crops before composting it. They call it night soil. And if you look at like Europe in the Middle Ages, there was an occupation of night soil man. They call it night soil because it's soil you gather at night. They'd come in the night, they'd collect the stuff, and they'd cart it out to the countryside and sell it to farmers. And the farmers would put it on their crops, and communicable diseases were rampant in the Middle Ages in Europe. But it's important to also note that this is still practiced in many places in the world. People will directly put night soil on their crops. But there is a corollary to that in the sense that if they're not composting it, and they're aware that this is something that can make them sick, the way that they have adapted to this, because it's free instant fertilizer, I mean, the stuff works. The way that they have adapted is many cultures in which this stuff is used without composting it, they traditionally will never eat raw vegetables. Vegetables are always cooked in one way or another, whether it's boiled or stir-fried or something, but people will not eat raw vegetables. They will peel their vegetables. They will take measures to keep themselves safe from communicable diseases and parasites and things like that. But when you use the composting method, you really don't need to worry about any of that. But if you are worried about it, just, put it on your flowers, put it on your fruit trees, put it on things that are maybe not going to directly touch your veggies. Easy enough. It's still good, useful stuff that's not going to be going to waste. Still a very low barrier of entry. And that's me done talking about this topic. So here we have multiple composting bins. Usually we make them out of old pallets. We just screw things together, use whatever random wood posts we have around. So this is our current Humanure pile. I believe this one is whatever we sweep out of the goat and the chicken house, or sometimes we compost our horse stuff too. This one's empty, waiting to be filled. And this one is last year's Humanure pile. It's maturing. The Humanure piles mature for 1 or 2 years after you finish it, just to make sure that the heat from the active pile and that the time of maturing can kill anything that is a potential pathogen or parasite. So here are the buckets we're going to add to the pile today. You notice they're covered in sawdust, and that's proper care. Anytime you make a deposit in your bucket, you want to make sure you cover it with sawdust. If you don't cover it with sawdust, you leave it open to things like flies landing on it and stuff like that, and so it's proper to make sure that you cover your deposit with sawdust. However, the flies and stuff is not as much of an issue here in the cold climate, especially during this time of year. It's important that when you're adding to your pile, you start the very bottom of the pile with a spongy layer of like old dead wood, whatever acts as basically a layer of wood on the bottom to be kind of a sponge. And you start it in the middle, and every time you add to it, you add to the very center. So you're digging, go ahead and film the pile here, you're digging into the very center, move things aside a little bit, because if you add to the center, then the center is always hot, and that you're always adding to that heat source right in the middle. Now you see we also have a lot of kitchen compost in here. But adding to the middle keeps the pile alive, keeps it hot. I think those are banana peels in there. Okay, and actually, I don't know if you can see this, but there's steam because the pile is hot. So I'm going to start with the small bucket here. I'm just going to put that in there. Alright. And then after you've added your new stuff, anything that you pushed aside, just bring that right back to the top, cover it back up, and the next step, I went and grabbed a little bit of water, put water in the little bucket, kind of swirl it around a little bit, rinse out the bucket, pour the little one into the big one. Do the same thing with that. Rinse out the bucket. Pour that on the pile. A little bit of moisture is good for it, although it's raining right now, so I don't need to worry about there being moisture on the pile, but moisture is essential for keeping things live and active. Now the final thing is to cover your pile. Now, we like to use sawdust because it's free, it's easy for us to access. We got really, check out the sawdust here. When we come home from town or whatever, we stop by a lumber mill that gives you free access to sawdust. And again, there's not really any flies this time of year. If it was summer, I'd be a little bit more vigilant about making sure the pile is covered and that anything wet is covered so that, you know, flies are not landing on. But you got a good, you know, general good little layer of cover material. And I like this really fine sawdust, but in the past we have used leaves, especially cottonwood leaves, and we used to go rake up a bunch of leaves. We'd have bags and bags and bags of leaves, and we'd use leaves as cover material for the pile, and that worked really good. That makes for some great compost. But sometimes what else we will do, if we are worried about the pile blowing away in the wind, the cover material blowing away, is I'll actually add the water at the very end, and that wets down the leaves or the sawdust and kind of make sure that it stays in place. Now right now we're having an anomalously warm winter. It snowed a tiny bit overnight, but now it's turned to rain, so we don't really need to worry about the pile freezing. We don't need to worry about keeping the pile moistened. But sometimes it does freeze really badly in winter. And sometimes what that does is it freezes the top of the pile. The middle of the pile is still active and hot and composting. But what it can do is it can kind of basically create a little lid on the top, a frozen lid of cover material. And so what you can do is you can take your shovel and you basically like peel back the lid. Your lid sits on the side and it's all frozen solid. You dig in the pile, you add your stuff to the center, add some cover material, and you just put the lid right back on. Adding to the pile in summer might be a little bit different. I know it looks really gross, but most of the grossness you're seeing is actually just from our kitchen compost. And if you're not sure whether or not this will work for you, I can say that we've been doing this for over 10 years and never been sick from it. And that also in summertime when we've got a load of salmon carcasses, we'll add those salmon carcasses after filleting the fish. We'll add them to the center of the pile. And within 2 weeks, they're completely gone. They're decimated. The heat, the bacteria have eaten through that salmon. So it's, if you're ever worried about whether or not these piles get hot enough to kill any potential pathogens, they get hot enough to decimate salmon bones and skulls and eyeballs and all that other stuff that we're not actively eating. So as long as your piles get really hot, get a compost thermometer if you're not sure if they're getting hot enough. And if they're getting hot and you let them sit for 1 or 2 years after you finish off the pile, you will not get sick, assuming that you're making sure your pile is well covered. Again, this is how we do it. This is how we do it in this climate. It might be a little bit different where you are, but this also makes sure that our garden soil is about as good as it can get. And then the last thing you do before you take your buckets and put them back in your Humanure toilets, you take some sawdust and you coat the inside of your buckets with sawdust. And you just put them back in and go for the next round, as long as you make sure you keep covering your deposits with sawdust, keep covering your pile with sawdust, add to the center of the pile, follow all the instructions, go download the Humanure Handbook to learn how to do it the right way. And that's it.